Hello again. This is another video on word order. Today we're talking about the word order of a question. If you haven't seen the word order video on statements, I recommend watching that one first because I will be referring to it. So a quick review. Statements. These are the two statements we saw in the previous video. The first one, simple present and affirmative, and the second one, present perfect and negative. And you'll probably recall that the order of a statement is this, with the subject and verb first and the rest of the sentence after. The same thing in the second one. Subject, verb, and the rest. The rest might include an object, prepositional phrase, adverbs, etc. The second example has an auxiliary verb in the main verb, in the verb phrase, in front of the main verb. When there is an auxiliary verb, this is where it appears, and it never comes before the subject in a statement. And that's what's the most important thing here, is it's different in a question. So let's look at the question form. If I were to ask a question that would elicit this statement, maybe, where do you live? I live near the park. Or a question for the next one, has he called you yet? He hasn't called me back yet. There is a very different order of the words in the sentences here. So in the statement, I live. In the question, do you live? I've actually had to add an extra verb, do. It's an auxiliary. It did not exist in the affirmative version of the statement. So I've had to create an auxiliary to make a question because most questions in English require an auxiliary, and that's a very important thing for our students to know. And the other thing is that the auxiliary is in front of the subject, which is not what happens in a statement. And if you look at the second example, I already have an auxiliary, hasn't, because it's the present perfect. So I don't need to create a new auxiliary. I'll just move it into the question, but you'll see it also appears before the subject. So this is the part of the sentence that we're focusing on. And this change is called inversion. It's a switching. In other words, the subject and the auxiliary trade places. And when a speaker says that and the listener hears that, we understand it's not a statement, it's a question. So if you recall from the last video, the order of a statement is abbreviated SVO, subject, verb, object, or subject, verb, and the rest. And this is how we can remember the sequence. So when we're talking about questions, we can use this acronym. And this is to help our students remember the correct order of a question. QWASVO. Question words, auxiliary, subject, verb, objects, and the rest. So if you present this to your students and have them memorize this, it should help them when they need to produce questions on a test or when they need to produce questions in conversation. All they have to do is remember this acronym. Okay, I want to show you a chart now. This is a visual aid you can use in your classes when teaching QWASVO. Let's plug in the two questions that we've been working with, and you can see in what position each word falls in the chart. You might notice with the first question, there's nothing in this position. And if you recall from the statements video, it's not a necessity to have an object or a complement or whatever in the rest position. It's very common that a sentence ends with the verb. So it's not necessary to have something in this column. But why is this column blank? It has to do with this question, has he called you yet? It's a very particular type of question. There are only two possible responses. Yes, he has, or no, he hasn't. This is what we call a yes-no question. The other question, where do you live? You cannot respond to this question yes or no. You have to give a piece of information for the response. It's called a WH question or an information question, where the response is related to the question word, in this case, a place. So the first thing we want to note about the QWASVO pattern in the chart is that when the question word column is blank, you're looking at a yes-no question. Otherwise, it's a WH question. Now, maybe I want to have a yes-no question with do. You could say, do you live downtown? And now it's a yes or no question. Yes, I do. No, I don't. Or I can have a WH question in the present perfect. Why hasn't he called you yet? Now, what's very important here is the auxiliary. As I mentioned before, we can tell that we're asking a question by the position of the auxiliary and the subject. So let's take a little time to review our auxiliaries in English. We're going to divide them into 4 different categories: the verb to be, simple tenses, present tense, perfect tenses, and modals. The verb to be is always different. It follows its own rules, so that's why we're going to have a different column there. The verb to be auxiliaries are am, are, is in the present, and in the past, was and were. Simple tenses, I'm referring to the present simple and the past simple only, and those use the auxiliaries do and does and did. When I mention perfect tenses, I'm talking about the present perfect, simple and continuous, and the past perfect, simple and continuous, not the future perfect. That uses a modal. So those auxiliaries are have and has and had in the past. And our modals, there are many. Here they are. We use them to make a bunch of questions, and we'll see different examples with those. But let's start with the verb to be. So here are many different questions with the verb to be. Some of them are yes and no questions. Some of them are WH questions. Some of them have objects or prepositional phrases, something in the other position, the rest position, and some don't. Let's look at the first 4. This is the verb to be in the simple present, but it doesn't function like any other verb. The verb to be is always very special, and you might notice there's nothing here. Although in these 4 examples the verb to be is the main verb, it never takes this position. We do not put the verb to be over here. It is the main verb here, but it always takes the auxiliary position. So you'll find students often make mistakes like these when making a question with the verb to be: what your name is, or where you are from, because they don't understand that the question order has to be different. We need to move it in front of the subject. In these 2 examples, we're looking at the present continuous. So here the verb to be is in fact a true auxiliary. It takes the auxiliary position as always, and in the verb column we see a ing verb. Because it's continuous, it takes the present participle, the ing form. In the last 2 examples I have here, I see the verb to be in the past. How was the party? That's the simple past. And just like in the simple present, the verb to be is the main verb, but in the auxiliary position. So there's nothing in the verb position. And the second example, were you sleeping through the match? The verb to be is the auxiliary, and I have an ing present participle in the verb position. Let's look at some simple tenses now. So simple tenses with verbs other than be. When the verb is not be, and we're talking about the present simple, simple present, or the past simple, or simple past, this is what the questions look like. Look at the first 4. This is the simple present. What happens to the verb? The verb is in the base form. We do not conjugate it to agree with the subject. So a very common mistake that your students might make is they'll do this. What your father does. Or in the 4th one, does she plays, forgetting that that verb needs to be in the base form. Also, they will forget to use the auxiliary altogether, like in the second example, or they don't move it in the right position. So these are some very common mistakes. Before we go on, I'd like to just note a little thing here about adverbs. We saw in the statements video that adverbs can be put within the pattern, within the SVO pattern, and same thing for the QWASVO pattern. They will appear here. If the adverb is related to the verb, it's part of the verb phrase, you can stick it between the subject and the verb. So I can say, do you eat there for dinner? Or do you usually eat there for dinner? And the word usually should appear in this position. Okay, now we see the simple past. In the simple past, the auxiliary is did. Doesn't matter what the subject is, it's always did. But the verb is still in the base form, and that's true for simple present and simple past. So again, you're going to have common mistakes like these. The auxiliary will be left out, and they'll forget to not conjugate the base verb, they'll leave the base verb conjugated in the past when it should not be. Something else that I'm going to mention before I move on. In the question words column, we're not only dealing with one word, what, who, where, when, how. You can have a whole phrase over here, like how often, what film, what time, what kind of food. You can have an entire phrase in the question words section, not just one word. Okay, so how about perfect tenses? Perfect tenses, again, I'm referring to the present perfect and past perfect, both their simple and continuous forms. So the first three here, this is the present perfect simple. I have the auxiliary has or have, depending on the subject. And the verb remains in the past participle. And that's the present perfect. It already has an auxiliary, and the verb is in the past participle. You don't need to change anything except the order. The auxiliary comes in front of the subject. So students will often make mistakes like these usually, forgetting to move the auxiliary in front. This is another example of a place where you can add an adverb. It's very common maybe in a question like this. When have I lied to you? When have I ever lied to you? Adverbs like these usually appear in these types of questions, and they must go between the subject and the verb. This one is the present perfect continuous, and it has the same auxiliary, have or has, and we see over here a continuous verb. We're going to use the verb been every time, and then the present participle. And both of these verbs take the verb position. Here is the past perfect. Just like in the other examples, I have a past participle. Students will make similar mistakes as with the present perfect. Here, just as a note, we have a negative question. The auxiliary can be affirmative or negative, so we can ask negative questions too. Finally, modals. So with modals, we have a variety of functions and tenses at use, but modals are auxiliaries, and so they must take the auxiliary position. If you look at the first two, I have modals used in pretty basic ways. Can I, should they, just note that there is an inversion there. Your students might try to say I can or they should. If you look at the verb, it's in the base form, just like a simple tense. Modals are always followed by the base form. The next two examples are the future. I have the future simple and the future continuous. And for the future, the auxiliary is will. It's a modal, and it takes the auxiliary position. The verb form should be simple, should be the base form, or the base form plus an ing if it's continuous. This is also another example where you can use an adverb. I have the adverb still. Finally, I have some past modals. Past modals are modals that use have plus the past participle. And that's what appears in the verb column. Every time we're going to have an auxiliary, then the subject, and then the rest of the verb phrase, have done, have come, have seen, have been, etc.